Hello and welcome to Talent Acquisition Trends and Strategy. I'm your host, James Mackey, and today we are joined by Brandon Metcalf. Brandon, welcome to the show.
Hey, James, thanks for having me on.
Yes, I'm really excited about this. I've had a great time talking with you at a couple of events we've met up at, and very, very familiar with Talent Rover. I think I told you at one of the events, my company was actually considering Talent Rover. And we were ready. We finally decided, okay, we're going to do that. And at the time, you guys had moved up to a new tier where you were targeting customers at, I think, like 30 or 50 seats minimum. So we ended up not making that cut at the time. But I really respected what you had built and heard of it. And so I'm really pumped about this conversation and to learn more about everything you've done. But yeah, before we jump into it, I was hoping you could just provide a bit of an introduction about yourself. So really the point, just to make sure that our listener base has a good understanding of your perspective and where you're coming from with the topics we discuss.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. I was also excited to be on and chat with you. Our conversation so far outside of this have been great. So I'm assuming this is going to be a fun chat. So my background, I started out of school at Bank of America and was building or running banks for the first several years of my career. And then I got a bit bored with that and stumbled into staffing and recruiting. And took a job with Kelly Services and held various different leadership roles with Kelly across the country. Eventually got recruited out of that to go to Google. I turned Google down, which was kind of crazy at the time, but I was glad I did. And then two, I joined a company called CV Partners, which was an executive retained search firm in San Francisco, really focused on C-level or VP level finance searches during one of the booms. Did that for a while and then just got really frustrated with technology that was available and said there's got to be a better way to do recruiting and the better way to manage staffing firms from a technology standpoint. And that was in 2009, which is when I got the idea for Talent Rover. So we built Talent Rover originally for us internally, but then in 2011 we commercialized it, went to market, scaled it globally, ended up selling it to Bullhorn in March of 2018. And then when I left, I had an idea to create a new company, which is called Place, which is a software company for software companies. So basically, we manage subscription management, bookings and billings, and revenue forecasting, all of that for SaaS companies. And at the same time, I started a consulting firm because I was just getting a lot of people hitting me up about how do you do recruiting on Salesforce and just how do you manage Salesforce in general. So I created a company called Blueprint, which is still one of our companies now. And then through that experience over the past really year and a half, we started engaging directly with Salesforce about recruiting and about staffing on Salesforce, and started to come up with what eventually became Assemble, which is my newest company and newest product, which is an applicant tracking system built on Salesforce that's designed for both corporate recruiters, but also staffing and recruitment firms.
Got it. And I want to spend the majority of today focused on Assemble. I think that there's a lot of unique in terms of insights and value proposition that we can provide to talent acquisition leaders tuning in on the advantages of working with an applicant tracking system that's built into Salesforce. And I'm most curious to learn about more so the workflows, data and reporting and insights that can be driven through the functionality in Salesforce to better inform talent strategy, annual planning, budgets, these types of things for, again, talent acquisition leaders that are scaling and thinking about how to structure and build out their internal team, how to engage with agency recruiters, and how to look at, again, their funnel to optimize toward the most efficient and scalable placement sources and understand more so about what's working and what's not. So could you share a little bit more about exactly the gaps that you've identified in talent acquisition and that you see Assemble solving for talent acquisition leaders?
Yeah, and as much as I have technology to help in these spaces, I've also built several companies myself, so I know what it's like to try to find talent and keep talent and manage talent, not just in the United States, but Talent Rover, we had 9 offices in 8 countries and literally people everywhere. Currently with Assemble and with Place, we have employees in both the United States and also in India. So this topic, talent acquisition in general, is such a near and dear topic to my heart. But when we decided to build Talent Rover way back in 2009, we had an idea of, let's create one platform that did everything. That was from, how do you source candidates? How do you match candidates? How do you place candidates? And then the staffing world, how do you bill for those candidates? How do you pay those candidates, and all of those types of things? And I think there was a lot of players that really focused on that. They wanted to be one solution that does everything. Over the years, especially with stepping out of the recruitment space with the work that we've been doing with Place over the past 4 years, we started to look at things a little bit differently. And we started to think about, do companies really want one solution that's supposed to do everything? There's benefits to that, right? Of, okay, if I can do everything on one platform or one software, then I shouldn't need to go into multiple systems and do all of that, which was one of the things I hated when I was at Kelly. We had so many different disconnected systems. One of them even had a green screen, and that wasn't too terribly long ago, but it was a while ago. That just, you wasted so much time just to do the core functionality of your job that it was maddening. So what we really thought about over the past couple of years, and especially over this past year, was, if you look at a lot of the other technology that's available, like on the sales side of the equation, for example, Salesforce, great CRM, there's a lot of different products that bolt into Salesforce to enhance the process. Companies like SalesLoft or Outreach, or you name it, there's tons of great sales engagement platform tools, all built to natively work inside of Salesforce. When we looked at, okay, well, what's really happened in recruiting? There's tons of recruitment technology out there. But one of the things that we saw was, like, the number one thing in my mind for recruiting is engagement. How are you talking to candidates? How are you talking to hiring managers, and be it internal hiring managers or external hiring managers if you're in a staffing firm, and really engaging and keeping the conversation going. And on the candidate side, making it a true, meaningful, simple, productive way to stay in contact with all of these potential candidates. And, I think on the sales side of the house, there's a lot of technology that allows you to engage really well with prospects. And we wanted to take some of that and say, look, why can't that be applied to recruitment? And specifically, why can't we have recruiters with the ability to manage and control their recruitment processes themselves? So if you look at legacy ATS, both corporate and external, when you buy an ATS, the ATS tells you what your stages are. It tells you, I'm just going to make this up. First stage is applicant, so associating a candidate to a job. The second stage is some type of interview. How are we going to go through the interview process, making an offer, placing the candidate? And those are the basic stages. Similar stages in staffing, right? Well, in reality, though, how many times are you working on a search that there's other things you need to do in that search? Maybe there's a screening you have to do at one step that's different from another. Maybe you need a level another type of person interviewing, or your interview cycle is different. There's different flows and different steps. And we saw this in staffing too with Talent Rover, where customers were wanting more flexibility with what the stages were. And what ended up happening is you end up working outside of the ATS. You end up doing all of that stuff in spreadsheets or some type of organizational system that allows you to manage it. But as soon as you start working out of the system, not only are you creating inefficiencies for yourself, but now you're starting to impact the company. Like, now you're starting to impact, how do I get data and report and measure how successful we are with our recruiting activities? And you start to get gaps because that data is not consistent and that data is not contained in a place that can be reported off of. So we said, what if we do two things? What if, one, we give recruiters the ability to define their stages inside the solution? Through clicks, you can set up whatever your stages are. Maybe it's application, and then you have a screening, and then you do an interview, and then you have another screening, whatever it is. But you can set this up, and you can set this up per job rec, or if you're in staffing per client, it doesn't really matter. It's completely agnostic, where you get to pick your stages, but then you get to pick the actions that trigger off of those stages, so that you're fully in control and you don't have to create workarounds outside of the ATS. The ATS is designed to give you the ability to create these workflows that you need to support your business. And then the other piece of it is what happens if we go out and we partner with leading solutions for specific areas. Like, for example, we're not the right people to tell you how to do search and match and that whole algorithm of how you're matching candidates to clients and all of that. But we've gone out and find a partner that gets the vision of assembling these recruitment tech stacks, that they've now also built their product on the same platform that we're built on, which is Salesforce. And our two products work hand in hand with each other. So now you can do sourcing and parsing and matching, and then this whole ATS piece. Then we can also do it inside of Salesforce, which has a very robust suite of features and products that allow you to engage with your candidates and even your clients. And that's what we set out to solve.
I see a ton of value in this, and I already could tell that it has the potential to be a very big company and solve, I think, for particularly later growth stage SaaS companies that, you know, they're growing beyond a couple hundred employees, are going to start to need a little bit more of a robust tech stack, more integrations, more visibility into reporting, and to really understand how to create a scalable program. So I see a ton of value in that. And just quick question, I do have some follow-up questions, but the first thing I want to ask you is related to the integrations and the partnerships. So these different partners that may be specialized in different areas, are they included in a license cost, or are these add-ons that your clients would add separately in addition to your license cost?
Yeah, so this was a big focus of ours is, you know, Salesforce is the platform and the primary product that our customers are buying, right? And, you know, building Talent Rover 100% on Salesforce, back then we really reinvented Salesforce to become something else. And when we did that, we actually limited some of the Salesforce functionality because we couldn't sell that as part of our product. So when we started looking at bringing an ATS back to Salesforce in the way that we're thinking, we specifically said is like, no, we want clients to get the full power of Salesforce. So they buy a Salesforce license from Salesforce. And then we're an add-on license to that. So then the partners will be add-ons as well. Now, if you look at our price point and the philosophy around Assemble, you've got to really focus to make sure the overall purchase price that the customer is going to buy with Salesforce and all the other add-ons is reasonable still. Right. So our seat price at Assemble is $25 per seat, which is extremely low for the industry if you look at it as being a full-blown ATS. But we're one business process inside of the entire talent engagement process, and we price the product that way, and so do our partners. So yes, it's an additional add-on for the different components you want. But the overall price point is still going to be similar to what you're paying now for a fully fledged, built out one solution. The difference is you're not paying for stuff you're not using. So like a lot of times when we sold Talent Rover to staffing firms, they didn't want our timesheet system. Well, they were still paying for it in the license price. This now gives you the ability to say, I want this, and I want this. And this is my preferred vendors, because there'll be multiple vendors that do the same type of thing. So you can pick and choose who you want and only pay for what you need. And also you can look at it as well as like, maybe not everyone in my organization needs this license. They only need this license. So you can pick and choose who gets what as well to help you contain cost.
Well, so yeah, so from my perspective, just so everyone understands my perspective, I run an embedded recruiting firm. So basically companies borrow recruiters from my company. And I've also run talent acquisition for 4 SaaS companies. And from my perspective, I think it's way more valuable to be able to pick and choose the add-ons versus having this approach where you're kind of stuck with a specific vendor list. So I think this is much preferable because people have different philosophies, different focuses. And then also different businesses have different needs based on the types of roles that they're hiring for. I mean, you know, a company that's hiring for engineers at scale is going to be drastically different than a company that's hiring nurses at scale, right? So it doesn't make sense to have the same tech stack for drastically different industries. So I think that's really smart. The other follow-up question I had was just related to like, or did you have another follow-up point on that?
I was going to say, my business partner will be thrilled when I say this, because this is his analogy he just made up. Nice. He's like, think of it like the cable industry. You used to buy cable and you get all of this stuff. that you never watched. And then now all of a sudden with streaming, you pick all the different stuff that you actually want to watch and you're paying for that. It's the exact same concept with recruitment tech sec.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy.
He'll be
Yeah,
very
I think
proud of that and
yeah,
pleased that you
he's
said
good. He's
that.
gonna bake that into your marketing material. Yeah, so that's really cool. I think the other thing that really resonated with me is having consistent stages, but allowing for custom interviews and workflows within those stages so that you can pull reporting. I did that when I implemented. I mean, we've implemented for our primarily for like companies under 100 employees. We've actually managed ATS implementations and building them out correctly to provide the right reporting visibility to prepare companies for extensive scale, right? Like when companies are hitting like Series C, right? And they're going to go, or Series B, and they're going to go from like 100 people to a 500 person organization. And they really have to, start getting a little bit more thoughtful in terms of how they're thinking about their talent acquisition strategy. So basically what we would provide is like a 4-step kind of stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. But then the hiring managers have the ability to customize interview workflows within those stages so that we could pull reports that can show consistency across the board, but, allow for, I guess, nuance or just different interview workflows. So I think that's really cool. And then the other thing that we're doing right now is we currently have Greenhouse as a agency resource. We have Greenhouse for our client ATS that we're, what I mean by that is that we're tracking all of our clients' hiring and interview workflows and candidates through Greenhouse through some custom fields so that we could create like several basically clients within one Greenhouse instance. And that's basically allowing us to pull data in aggregate across all of our client base to get insights about, placement sources and other very relevant things that are going to help companies hire. So I see a ton of insight value in being able to segment by stage and then do so in a way that's reportable. So that's just something I wanted to slow down on because that is, and a lot of the ATSs don't. I mean, Greenhouse has that functionality. I think Lever might, but a lot of them don't have that. Like it's, as you said, you're kind of stuck. Like stages and interviews are bucketed together in one thing versus separate motions where you can figure out, do it more effectively to report the right way.
Yeah, and like as the company grows, how often have you implemented a software that all of a sudden you go, well, now I need to do all this other stuff and this doesn't do this for me. And now I need to rip and replace and all of that. So that's the other logic here as well, is giving the flexibility as things get more complicated or maybe things get more high volume. Like one of the things we learned at Talent Rover was we want to deal with True Blue, which is a multi-billion-dollar staffing firm. But they were hiring more blue collar type workers, where the traditional ATS stages that we had as far as associating a candidate to a job, submitting that candidate to the hiring manager with the resume, and then moving through the interview stages, that didn't work in their world because they were hiring people for a 1-day job or 2-hour job who didn't have resumes. So we had to rethink and try to figure out how we were going to solve that. And some of the conversations we're having with some multi-billion-dollar firms right now around, mass hirings and how do they start thinking about when they come out or when we come out of whatever economic climate we are and everyone starts hiring like gangbusters again, they're already thinking about how do we get the right tools in place to actually do that successfully and maximize on the market. So they're looking at Assemble saying, can you guys do high volume internal corporate hiring? And the answer is yes. And can you also do more of the traditional, slower one-off times, or can you do C-level hiring and then also, I need to hire a bunch of factory workers at the same. All of that stuff with the way we've thought about Assemble was like, yeah, you can adjust your processes to do all that. What I liked about what you were saying with implementing different systems is all of that comes with time and money associated with it. What we're trying to do with having a product that gives you that level of flexibility is to get rid of that time and money element. to make it super fast, because it's all built to do exactly that. So you're not having to spend a fortune on external fees to rip and replace or completely reconfigure your process.
It's really cool. And one thing that I think could be an important differentiator to mention is not only having separate workflows that funnel up through stages, but literally having separate buckets and pipelines.
Yeah.
Like within Salesforce, for instance, like you can have, high intent website conversion, right? Then you can have, like a partnerships, and those are separate buckets where you can put those pipelines in aggregate, but you can also separate them. So what made me think about this is like executive search is a completely different motion than recruiting for an individual contributor role.
Yeah.
So, of course you can look at those pipeline reports in aggregate and look at conversion rates, but those are drastically different search motions. So I think Salesforce probably allows you to segment those pipelines so you can look at them individually, because there's no sense, and from a reporting standpoint, bucketing SDR search with executive search and then taking the average of that and then looking at the metrics that way. So that's one thing that you can't do with traditional applicant tracking systems. I don't think without actually, if you had like a data tool stacked on top, you might be able to do it, but that's a very big differentiator and value add from my perspective. Have you guys thought about that? And just curious.
Yeah, we've thought a lot about that. And, even on my other company Place, we've thought about that as well. So like one of the things that kind of fell into place with all of this for us, I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem since 2004. I've been building Salesforce-based businesses since 2009. And most of those businesses have been in the recruitment space. So we have years of experience of learning of how to try to build some of these things, but to build them from a product company standpoint, not from an internal customization standpoint. And there's a very big difference when you're building software to commercialize or you're building it internally, just from a foundational thought process and management style of how you build it. The other thing that, fell into place for us was the 7 years of Talent Rover, of seeing all of these different recruitment styles around the world. I mean, we were in 40 different countries. Adecco was our largest client. So we had the entire Adecco relationship minus just a few countries. So we got real exposure to how do you do recruiting in the US? How do you do recruiting in Europe? How do you do it in Asia? How do you do it in Australia? And we heard over and over different feature requests and problems that these recruiters were having with being able to complete their job. And, I personally think agency recruiting and internal recruitment, as much as there's different stages and a different end goal, recruiting is recruiting. You're still going through the same things of finding the right candidates for the right jobs and making those candidates successful and all of that stuff. So learning through all of that, and while at the same time learning the full capabilities of Salesforce, really makes us unique in what we're doing. So when we look at building this stuff, we take data into deep consideration, but it's not just the data, it's the reporting of that data. And how do you get the analytics out to tell you really what's happening in whatever processes you are? So that's always the first lens that we look at, is how do I get information out? Because this is what everyone's going to want to know if they're successful or not. Two, the second lens is, how does someone actually use this thing? Like, how do we maximize their efficiency? So like when we're talking about giving you the ability to create different stages and actions, that's because we heard over and over from recruiters, I have to do this outside of your system. How do we give you the ability to do that in the system? Because if you use the system and we have the data structure to report off of, all of a sudden we have magic. And the Salesforce platform for us actually becomes perfect for that because we know it so well. But to your point, there's a whole analytical layer of Salesforce if you know how to program in Salesforce to get the data to work in the constraints of Salesforce reporting.
Right. And I think a lot of companies and talent acquisition leaders, from a reporting standpoint, are really only able to look and track candidate pipelines, but they're not necessarily pulling insights.
Yeah.
Like the reporting isn't set up with the right functionality to actually impact annual planning and how they're going to approach building teams, what tools and tech stack to implement, where how to optimize like top performing hiring sources. Like it's just not very robust. So I think, and the other thing I just want to follow up on is you brought up an interesting point. When you're working with globally distributed teams, being able to segment out by region is going to be really important, because obviously we already discussed stages, and stages could also vary, I guess potentially based on region, but hiring source could vary greatly. Like for instance, like Jim might be more effective in LATAM, or just different tools could be more effective in different regions, right? And you might see, I suppose in some reasons, outbound sourcing having a larger attribution to hiring than inbound, or there could be different ratios, right?
Yeah.
In terms of percentage of hires. So being able to segment out those buckets as well on a regional basis is another interesting way to think about talent acquisition, because the larger you get, the more I feel like to some extent, the less effective an aggregate report company wide really helps you.
I also think engagement, like sources are extremely important, right? Especially so you can quantify ROI. And one important thing is, like, every time you hire someone, where did they come from? And what are you paying for that source? And was it worth, is that source worth it? You can do all of that if you track the source and all of that through Salesforce. If you have like an Assemble plugged into it, because we're tracking all of that stuff. The other piece that I think is critical is candidate engagement. How are you communicating with people? Do they respond via text? Are you able to capture that text message, and how? What about email? What about phone call? What about WhatsApp? There's a variety of different ways, including like we're seeing Slack, and we're actually doing a lot of stuff in Slack, which I'll be excited to announce here in the next couple of months. But like, how do you really engage with people? And this, when we're thinking about solving this problem, this is yet another reason where we're like, look, we want that Salesforce engagement layer, and we want to partner with all the Salesforce partners that extend that engagement layer to make it so stupid simple to be able to get a hold of someone, and also to understand how is that person, that candidate, engaging with you. And are they easy to get a hold of? Do they respond? Do we know where they're working? All of those different types of things Salesforce can do a brilliant job of.
So I have a follow-up question on that. From a reporting standpoint, is there a way to track candidate engagement, and how do you measure that? Can you tell me just more about that, like actionable, like if I wanted to do that, right? For myself or one of my clients, like how do you even go about doing that on Salesforce in an effective way?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too technical in the weeds, let's just keep it surface level. Like during a sales process, right, which is what you typically think about Salesforce for.
Right.
You have contacts that you're emailing, you're phone calling, you're WhatsApping, you're Slacking, whatever you're doing. Well, if you look at recruitment through a sales lens, you're prospecting in a very similar way that an account executive at a tech firm would be. You're trying to go find the right candidates that have the right background for what you're looking for. So it's the same thing account executives are doing when they're looking for buyer persona and ICP of their target accounts. So then how do you try to connect with them? Do you email? Do you phone call? Do you WhatsApp? Whatever you do. But then how do you do a cadence to follow up? Like, first time you're going to phone call, second time you're going to email, third time you're going to do a text message, whatever. How are you stacking those cadences to get you in front of the candidates that you're looking for, to get them to respond to you and to talk to you, especially coming out of, and what we're still in with such a tight labor market? How do you stand out? It's the same thing in my mind that account executives are trying to do when they're trying to penetrate an account to bring that account in to buy their software. You're just selling something different. Salesforce natively has all of this built out. It's just applying a different lens to how you're using it.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've been talking about for years is that people need to be thinking about their recruitment motions similarly to how revenue organizations are thinking about revenue motions and funnels and optimization. And it's always surprised me the level of focus and data is put into revenue motions, but on talent acquisition, it seems that a lot is done based off feel.
Yeah.
And just, it's hard. Like a lot of talent acquisition leaders actually, I think, struggle with quantifying or actually putting into motion process and tech, because it's just not something that a lot of talent acquisition leaders aren't brought up in such a way to approach, I think, recruitment from a more technical, data-driven perspective. Like, I don't know about you, but I actually started my career in staffing as well, like in at Kforce. And so I came up in that environment, intern, SDR, account executive. Then I went to go work for a boutique agency. And there was really no emphasis, like, on our internal systems on anything really tech focused. We had a in-house built kind of CRM, if you will, if you could even call it that, which was basically just data entry and tracking, but there was no optimization. And then you see people coming from those environments and then being promoted into director of talent acquisition, VP of talent acquisition, if we're in-house roles that really don't have any experience or knowledge on how to build out systems at scale. So I think that you can learn a lot from revenue orgs. And if you look at sales motions and marketing inbound motions, there's so much to be learned. And I think that it's a huge missed opportunity for a lot of talent acquisition leaders. And I think quite honestly, I think a lot of talent acquisition leaders would be would learn a lot from taking like Pavilion's CMO, CRO courses.
Yeah. Like, I got an example for you. Imagine this, like, you're doing a lot of recruiting to fill a position. Same thing. You're doing a lot of prospecting to try to find a client. One of the things we do on the sales side with account executives and BDRs is we're constantly testing our messaging. What's working and what's not working. It's the same thing when you're going outbound to recruit. Like, if you're pitching a job via email, what version of that pitch is getting the best responses?
Yep.
And you can do that stuff with a full-fledged real CRM that's designed to do that exact same thing. Salesforce, you can leverage that to test messages and see what gets open, what gets clicked on, what gets replied to in mass. So apply that same logic to going outbound with how you're pitching a job. And what that tells you is not only what they're responding to via email, but when you're making phone calls and when you're connecting on LinkedIn or whatever, you can take that same messaging and apply that to your other channels that you're going outbound with, because now you have some basis as to what's working. And it doesn't have to be the whole company doing it. You individually as a recruiter can do that and see the results.
Sure. And I think that's also a huge missed opportunity. Like, for instance, like across our client base, around 80% of hires come from outbound messaging on LinkedIn, right? Like, and that's where I'm not saying there's some great platforms and tools out there that, I think are good to kind of just to add on to those efforts. But the reality is that at least for startup and growth stage tech, the majority of hires that we're seeing are coming from custom outbound messaging, the majority of which, on LinkedIn. And so I just think that there's a huge missed opportunity, because we might be looking at lead source to hire, but I don't think within that we're looking at, okay, let's look at, okay, so for the hires that we've made, what was the custom messaging? What key points were brought up? How is it positioned?
Yeah.
And what, how much of our hires, like, so if we determine, okay, like, 70% of the hires that occurred from outbound messaging started this way or included this type of information, then you can optimize not only toward that lead source, but how recruiters are actually engaging with candidates to then more effectively, like, just to increase the amount of hires that come from that lead source, which I really don't think, most companies are not doing this level of.
Yeah, well, and I think it's a missed opportunity, because I think the lead source is really important to tell you where buckets of candidates at that you need to go get and communicate with. But you could have the best bucket of candidates in the world, but if you don't know how to message what you're recruiting and why they should give a crap about the position, it doesn't matter. You're gonna have a hard time getting those candidates to still engage. You can maximize what you're saying to get them interested. Then you can really understand, is that the right bucket of pool of candidates? Is the source the right source?
Right. I mean, messaging is in direct correlation to the scalability of to that lead source.
Yeah.
Like, because if you have a shitty conversion rate between, messaging to hire or whatever metric you're looking at, that's not going to be scalable. And the more you're going to have to rely on agency recruitment to supplement those bad conversion rates, versus if you can go in and look at what specific messaging and outreach is actually going to generate a quality candidate into my pipeline that's ultimately going to result in more hires, then that becomes a much more scalable solution for you to manage in-house.
Spot on.
So it's like, you know, you look at the additional cost of creating these add-on tech stacks. It's when you look at, okay, yeah, we might be paying more from a license perspective on a month-to-month basis, but think about what's your budget for contingent recruitment, right? If you have to do, I don't know, like 20 hires at like a 25K fee at, let's just say 20%, this is very conservative, you're looking at like 500 grand.
Yep.
And that's just for 20 hires, which is pretty low volume. So, you know, when you start to think about license costs, there also has to be kind of a cost comparison. And I think that's something that talent acquisition leaders need to be thinking about too, when they're going to get budget approvals and doing annual planning. They need to be, you know, presenting license costs from the perspective of how that compares to agency usage and potential, you know, the way that things have been done traditionally, right, for the company. And they need to be able to sell kind of the story we're talking about in terms of explaining how investing in the right tech stack can help us create more scalable in-house solutions and help us also identify maybe the solutions or the lead sources that are not as scalable, and maybe kind of cutting those, or if they're, you know, attribution to hire is less, cutting those and honing in on the sources of hires that are not only more scalable, but accounting for like a larger percentage. And I think that's like a big gap. Like, I don't think a lot of talent acquisition leaders are doing that when they're presenting to leadership teams or getting budget approvals. And so, yeah, I think that that's another kind of skill gap or thing that a lot of leaders need to focus on as well.
I also think it's like, look, I mean, we're in a tough economic climate right now. None of us are sure what 2023 is going to be. And, you know, I talk with a lot of SaaS CEOs and all that, because I have my podcast that we get into that stuff. And, you know, I think one of the things on the talent acquisition side that's going to be important, especially in 2023, because regardless of what it is, it's definitely going to be a choppy year, is, do you have the tools that are making you more successful at the core focus of your job? And do you understand the data of where you're doing really well and the data of where you're not doing really well? And when you have to create a bunch of workarounds and have a lot of manual processes, you can't really get to the heart of that very easily. You definitely, as an talent acquisition leader, can't really get to what's making your team successful and not across the board if they're working around your systems and creating their own systems. So I think one of the themes for 2023, at least in my mindset, is how do you normalize some of that so you can invest where you need to invest. You know, I think if you have a strong talent acquisition team internally, most likely you're going to want to save as much cost as you can, especially in this environment, with using staffing firms. But how do you do that? And how do you know what you're spending money on is the right tools and the right technology to get you there?
Well, yeah. And that's where it's like, you know, to some extent, hiring does come in cycles. And so I think one of the things that a lot of CFO, COO types miss is they say, okay, well, hiring comes in cycles, so investment comes in cycles as well. And I think that if we kind of break those into two separate motions and understand that by planning mid to long term for hiring strategy actually enables you to have a lower cost per hire and a more sustainable budget. And so I think that that's where there's a pretty big disconnect, right? And I think that that's why it's like when hiring surges occur, like high level hiring cycle, right? Like, you know, when the economy shifts from good to bad, the first thing to go is the contingent agency recruiters. The second thing to go is the in-house recruiters. Then basically due to pent up demand, there's at least going to be backfill hires, and they don't have internal staff. So they start to bring agency recruiters back. Then they try to, you know, the market rebounds and they try to hire internal recruiters when everybody else is, which makes them leverage agency recruiters even more and blow up their budget. And so, you know, it's again, optimizing for tech stack is good because you can always have that in place. Even if you have to go through layoffs or, you know, cut vendors, you at least have that stack set so that when the market starts to rebound, you at least have that in place to accelerate hiring and not, you know, rely on as many internal recruiters because you have a more scalable solution, and two, not needing to rely on as many agency recruiters, right?
Yeah, and another lens of this, speaking of place, with place, we do workforce planning. Um, and one of the important pieces of that, like our clients are building out financial forecasts, right? They're building out financial forecasts to understand the profitability of the business or the P&L, but they're also building out financial forecasts to understand cash flow. So in the recruitment world, this directly impacts the forecast. So, have you quantified? Have you quantified the cost to the company, both from a profit and loss standpoint and a cash standpoint? If you have an open rec for a salesperson and you don't hire that salesperson on time, because typically financial forecasts are built off of that salesperson starting at a certain time and their quota ramp starting at a certain time. So understanding if that AE is hired a month late, what happens then? Or if your top AE gets recruited and goes somewhere else, what happens to the financial forecast? So, the recruitment element of the company is both important, for ramping and downsizing during good times and bads, but just the overall financial profitability of the company and the health of the company, like understanding how delays in the recruitment cycle flow through the whole company is really critical. And it also gives talent acquisition leaders a different argument to have about how much budget they should have with being able to execute on recruitment. Because if you miss hiring a top salesperson, here's the impact you're going to have to your bottom line. And I think that changes the narrative between talent acquisition and finance as to, or to C-suite, as to why it's so important to continue to invest in the right type of recruitment technology.
I agreed. And Brandon, I follow-up question on that, but I did want to let you know that we're up on time that we have budgeted here. Can you go a little bit over, or do you need to jump?
I can say a little bit.
Okay, cool. So follow-up question with place, who's in the buyer seat there? Because I'm assuming, like, you're right. I think that'd be a valuable insights for talent acquisition to share with finance leaders. But as somebody that isn't familiar, with your company or your solution, that solution very well, wouldn't like the CFO be or the finance leadership? Wouldn't they be a buyer for a tool like that?
Yes and no. I mean, depends on what part of the product we're looking at. So, the main thing for Place is we only sell to SaaS companies, and it's usually early stage, high growth SaaS, because all of our workflows, all of our mindset is built around that. This whole concept of, who am I planning on hiring and what's the impact if they don't get hired on time, and all of that is designed for SaaS companies and the ramp of the SaaS companies. But our buyers range from, yes, finance is a key buyer, but CEO, COO, head of sales, head of customer success, head of marketing, all those people are typically engaged. Usually we don't see the heads of talent acquisition engaged until we bring this conversation up, because companies aren't really thinking about that. But as soon as you start to bring up, hey, let us talk to whoever really manages your recruitment cycle to understand how this workforce plan that you're going to go out and create is going to impact them, and what happens if they don't hit it, then all of a sudden we're talking to the head of talent acquisition as well.
Right. And I'm sure that they ultimately start to become a champion, because they're like, oh, hell yes. Like, I need all the help I can get, to get the budget that I really need to be successful.
All of this ties together, but we get so caught up in silos of thinking, like what we were talking about earlier in the conversation about, candidate or recruiters going out and finding talent. Well, let's compare that to account executives going out and finding clients. There's so many different parallels of workflows throughout the business, but all of these things tie to each other. So understanding the work that a recruiter does of refilling or finding a candidate is directly going to impact your cash flow. People aren't thinking that way, and I think that's what can change.
Yeah, I think and one of the reasons I like that is it seems like companies are more likely to approve budgets when it comes to revenue motions. And so to the extent that you can tie recruitment budget to a revenue motion, the more likely that talent acquisition is actually going to be given an opportunity to thrive and do well. I mean, one of the things that I experienced at the time I was running talent acquisition for a 100-person SaaS company. And one of the challenges that I had was, it's like, I think in my first 8 weeks, we increased number of hires and velocity of number of hires by 200% within the first 8 weeks. And from there, it just seemed like every quarter over quarter, it was like, okay, great, we achieved a result. Can you do it with 15% less budget? And so I just constantly was like it's like, fuck, like, like
Well,
I'm
that's
getting
always the
results,
name of the
but
game though, right? Give me more
yeah.
for
And so
less.
that constantly happened. And so it's like proving that story and showing that data, um, it's increasingly more difficult to do when you have a minimal tech stack or you don't have the right technology to help you prove that story. You end up trying as a talent acquisition leader to do most of this manually and put it on spreadsheets. But then also there's a skepticism when, from a CFO perspective, when you're just throwing shit on a spreadsheet
Yep.
versus having it tied into your ATS or another technology to ensure accuracy. So being able to do it through tech brings a certain level of legitimacy to it. Like if it, from the perspective of like, it's not in the system, it doesn't exist. Right. And so it's when you're trying to prove a story as a talent acquisition leader and you don't have the tech and you're doing it from a spreadsheet, it makes it harder to sell that data story versus if you have the right tech in place where you can pull clean reports that are reporting from a system is going to allow you to make a better case to get the budget you need.
Yeah, and then also, where do you get all that extra time that it takes you to do all that stuff manually? Because you're already
Oh, it's yeah,
doing your core job.
yeah.
So,
It's yeah. You're
yeah.
working around the clock basically.
I mean, that's why Assemble was so important to us of saying, look,
Yeah.
there's so much stuff that's done outside the system. Why don't we just give you a way to do it in the system so that you can then leverage it in the most meaningful way?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I want to segue. There was one other topic. And by the way, man, just let me know how you're doing on time. I actually I have an internal meeting, but I can
Yeah, dude,
let
Joe,
them
we
know I'm
start
late.
thinking.
But I if we want, we can continue or we can cut now. What do you think?
I can give you 5 more minutes if you want to get
Okay.
to the last topic.
Yeah, let's do 5 more. So right now, like you're running several companies. I don't know how the hell you do it.
Huh.
But like I just wanted to get your thoughts on you're building your own teams, right? You're ultimately building teams of top talent to scale your companies, to create value.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about talent acquisition for your own companies, and what are the biggest, like, I think we could just do like a few high level points and maybe like a couple tactical points within there to help people walk away with stuff they can implement. But maybe we can focus on just like the top 2 or 1 to 3 things that you're doing right now.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, I have multiple companies going on, but it's really leveraging a great team or great teams at each of those different companies that make it manageable, that I can actually do all the different things that I have going on. For us, I think this is every other company. I know this was the same at Talent Rover. You spend a fortune of finding talent in one way or the other. But what do you actually do once that talent is with you? We talk a lot about doing exit interviews and figuring out why people left. But there's strategies that have really been talked about over the past year and a half that look at it a little differently, like retention strategies. Like, do you actually have a plan of retaining your people? What happens if your top salesperson comes in or your top recruiter comes in, whoever, and says, I quit. I got this crazy job offer. It's the conversation no manager ever wants to have, right? It's when someone comes to you and say, hey, can I talk to you? You're like, fuck, like,
Yeah.
now you're about to leave. And now you're scrambling. Like, do you have a plan in place? Or are you just going to react to say, okay, how much money do we have to throw at you to keep you or whatever? Well, do you actually understand all of your employees across the company? And if any of them resign today, what you would do? Not all of those people should get a counter. Not all of those people you want to retain. Some of those people you absolutely have to retain. But if they're already coming to you saying, I got a different job, you're already in a losing position.
It's too late.
So flip the script and say, okay, let me look at every single employee in the company. If that person leaves, who's going to replace them? Do I have that person in mind already to step in and do that job? Look at their jobs they're performing at and saying, can we afford to lose this person or not? If you can't, what are you doing to keep them? And one tip there that works really well is doing stay interviews. So meeting with them on a fairly frequent basis and asking questions, not about their performance, but asking them questions about why do you like being here? What can I do to make you more successful here? What do you not like about the company right now? What do you think needs to change? And just getting them to have the same conversation they would have with you in an exit interview, but doing it now when they're still employed, where you can actually impact their job and impact the relationship and ultimately retain those you want to retain, or leverage that information also to figure out how you would help move someone out of the organization you don't want to retain.
Right. I think and this is where you have to, I think sometimes companies get caught up on, we're scaling, we need to do everything in a scalable way that's going to be most time efficient. And so companies gravitate towards surveys versus actually, hopefully you've built up the unit economics of your business to where you can have a reasonable amount of direct reports, a reasonable ratio is what I'm trying to say between direct reports and a manager, where there's actually enough time and bandwidth to have this type of relationship and conversations. Because I think to some extent, when it comes to things like this, it's not, you shouldn't be focused on like, what's the most time efficient solution that scale, because sometimes you lose something there. And you have to remember, like when you're working with humans, like you need to actually take the time to dive in and understand their concerns and to learn from them. So I think it's just an important differentiator is that just doing a survey isn't good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Like you need to get in there and have these conversations. How often are you having these, like with your top people? Is this like a quarterly motion, twice a year?
Yeah, it just depends. It depends on your company, it depends on your role. I mean, like you were saying, your team should be able to do this. So I'm not typically the one having this with everyone in the company, right? There's just no bandwidth, especially when I have 3 companies. But the leadership team underneath, like, do they get this? Do they understand why we're doing this? Do the leaders that report into them get this? And you just kind of cascade it down and make it an expectation of we're having these conversations. And make it not a secret. Like, why would we need, and I think a lot of companies are concerned about this stuff, like, why would this need to not be something people are aware of that we do? Like,
Right.
We're wanting you to tell us what you like and what you don't like. Let's tell them that, because we want to make it the best company and the best culture, so they never leave. And I think the cadence, you just got to figure out your clip and what's realistic, but definitely more frequent than once a quarter, I would think.
For sure. No, I love it. And it's, when you're a small company, it's a little easier as the CEO to influence that, right? Like I have a top performer. It's like, all right, all right, what are we doing? Like, can we promote? Can we give a raise? Like what can we do in the short term to ensure that this individual stays? But then when you start to get a larger level of scale, you really need to create that expectation amongst other leaders to ensure that it's actually happening, right? Like we can't just make that happen at some point. So, well, Brandon, this has been incredible. I think this is just packed with value. Just so we recently started season 2 of the show. I'm not sure if this is going to be the first episode, but it'll be one of the first. And we're really leveling up the show, taking it to the next level. Just for everybody listening, we're going to really hone in and focus on how to help VPs of talent acquisition be successful and create scalable talent acquisition solutions. And I think just Brandon, like this episode is going to give people a lot to think about. And there's a lot of actionable things here, whether or not they're going to decide to move forward with a Salesforce solution or not. There's regardless if they even like just listening to you, regardless if they decide to move forward with your company, there's just so much value. And I think that if they just implement like one or two of the things that you talked about today, it's going to make their company a lot stronger. And I think I do personally recommend companies carefully considering Salesforce as a solution for an ATS, because again, I think to generate the best results, we need to start taking a more data-driven, technology-driven approach to talent acquisition. We need to stop operating off feel and start to get into the science of how to optimize different channels. And I think that Salesforce is by far the best solution to do so. So anyways, Brandon, thank you for joining us today. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm hoping that you'll come back for another episode, because this was just so much fun recording with you, man.
Hey man, thanks for having me on, and I was glad to contribute, and just let me know when.
Yeah, let's do it. And for everybody else tuning in, thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.